chooses to provoke Rome quite deliberately, and he presumably wants to show the Romans, look, we're Carthage, we're a strong, independent power, you can't push us around. And maybe he would have been quite happy if the Romans had just accepted that and acknowledged that Carthage had a right to exist, had a right to be strong. But part of him may also have hoped that the Romans will rise to the bait, they will fight a war, and then he can give them a real drubbing and show them that, look, you can't despise Carthage, we're stronger than you.
Hannibal's siege of Saguntum was a deliberate invitation to Rome to fight him. It worked and set the stage for the Second Punic War.
Hannibal knew that attacking Saguntum was a challenge to Rome. He didn't necessarily know how the Romans would respond to that challenge. However, he probably guessed pretty well that the Romans would be very ready for war, because the Romans nearly always were ready for war.
Hannibal's next move was also one Rome could never have predicted. They fully expected Hannibal to stay and fight in Spain. As far as Rome was concerned, Hannibal had no other choice. He couldn't go by sea, because Carthage was no longer the undisputed ruler of the waves. And because Italy was protected from land by the Alps, the walls of Rome, as they were comfortingly referred to by the Romans, they believed that invasion by land wasn't an option either.
They don't see how Hannibal could possibly get to Italy. And nobody ever dreams that anyone's going to be crazy enough to march all the way over land, from Spain, over the Pyrenees, through Gaul, across the Alps, and try and attack Italy. That just wouldn't have entered their wildest dreams.
Once again, Rome underestimated Hannibal. Taking an army of 50,000, a distance of more than 1,000 miles, would be daunting enough to most. With all their camp followers and families, the army itself would be strung out over 15 miles across hostile territory. With major rivers like the Rhone to cross, hostile Gauls to deal with, and even feeding an army of 50,000 for any length of time. This really was no picnic. And that's without his complement of 37 elephants.
My elephants, they eat about 150 to 180 kilo per day. And they drink about 150 to 200 liter water per day. If you can imagine with 37 elephants, how many food they need on one day. So it's about 7-8 ton a day. I think there was a big problem with Hannibal, because on this time you couldn't get no bananas for animals.
It wasn't only Rome that didn't expect an army to cross the Alps. The records tell us that many of Hannibal's own commanders expressed doubts about the prudence of such an enterprise. And when looking at what they had to endure, it's hard not to agree with them.
People read about Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. They tend just to romanticize it, to fantasize the glory and the adventure. The reality is something very, very different.
John Previs has spent 15 years studying Hannibal. And each year, he takes some of his students over the Alps, attempting to follow in Hannibal's footsteps and experience firsthand some of the challenges Hannibal and his men might have faced. While the exact route is still argued over, it's clear that the odds were stacked against him from the start. His first challenge was to stave off attack by hostile local tribes. Snaking through the narrow pass, at times only 2 or 3 abreast, his army was incredibly vulnerable. Twice, he was viciously ambushed by the savage tribes of Gauls. With great difficulty, Hannibal was able to beat off both attacks, but not without significant losses.
I think that at this point, when Hannibal crossed the Alps, It was certainly the point in his career that tested his mettle, if you will. This was the point where we were able to see the character of Hannibal, the leadership ability of Hannibal. We see Hannibal able to rally his men in the face of so much adversity, in the face of attack by the Gauls, in the face of the harshest elements imaginable, in the face of starvation. Hannibal keeps his men together and keeps the column moving up and over the Alps.
Hannibal crossed at the onset of winter. More used to the sunny Mediterranean, an army from Spain wasn't equipped to cope with such conditions. Each night he'd lose men to the effects of frostbite and exposure. And with no access to food, as he moved higher into the Alps, his provisions dwindled.
We don't know if Hannibal's men ever came to a point where they doubted him. We knew there were desertions, but not many. There were heavy casualties, but they had to put their faith in their leader. And Hannibal, we know, was a good general in many respects. For one thing, he connected with the common soldier. Hannibal chose to sleep on the ground with his men. He ate out of the same pots that his men ate. He would eat no more than his men would eat. So we know that Hannibal led by example, asking no more from his men than he himself was willing to give.
As Hannibal's army moved ever higher into the mountains, the risks to his men became more acute.
Donc il faut surtout qu'il reste pas passif, qu'il se laisse pas glisser. Parce que si tu te laisses trop glisser, tu prends trop de vitesse, tu ne peux plus t'arrêter, et arriver en bas avec les rochers, c'est la mort.
And this was something that Hannibal's army was about to discover for themselves.
Hannibal was able to rally them. They got to the top of the pass. Hannibal stood there and he said to them as they went over, "We've scaled the ramparts of Rome. The worst is over." Only to find that as they started down the other side, it was far worse than they could have imagined, because the descent into Italy was far more costly in terms of human life and human suffering than the ascent to the pass had been.
Just as Hannibal's army reached the highest pass and quite reasonably expected the worst to be behind them, the weather turned and fresh snow started to fall.
This was to be the most treacherous part of all. So now there was the old snow with a cover of new snow on it, making conditions even more treacherous because the old snow underneath had become like ice.
It's reckoned that Hannibal lost as many men and animals over the precipices as had been killed fighting the Gallic tribes. Indeed, when you look at the losses Hannibal's army sustained, it really makes things look a little different to the idealized and triumphal crossing of the Alps.
By modern day standards, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps was an unmitigated disaster. Hannibal suffered 50% casualties, a figure that today, politically and militarily, would be unacceptable in any war short of a nuclear war.
Hannibal entered the foothills of the Alps with an army of some 46,000 men. A combination of the two ambushes by the Gallic tribes, the appalling weather, and the treacherous descent all took their toll on his men. By the time he emerged